Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Both of these frightening accounts date back to the late Victorian era. The accuracy of the second sighting has even been confirmed by modern paranormal investigators. The Bloodstone Ring. The tiny village of Willisham in Ipswich, Suffolk, experienced gale-force winds one night in 1891. The storm lashed houses, ripping slates from the roofs and tearing branches from trees. A massive old oak was seen to shudder, then was caught by the onslaught of a mighty gust which toppled the tree, exposing its roots, which had been torn from the earth below. Villagers soon rushed to the spot to see if anyone had been hurt, but drew back in horror when they saw that between the gnarled roots there appeared to lie human remains. Police Constable Clugg, who was at that time the only serving bobby in East Anglia, was called, and he arranged for the body to be removed from its concealed grave. Strangely, one of the dismembered hands wore a ring on one finger. Acting on a hunch, Constable Clugg took the hand to Ellen Gray, the sister of a young woman who had vanished mysteriously in 1873, some 18 years before. Ellen screamed in recognition of the ghastly relic, which she clasped to her heart. She claimed that the hand was that of her sister Mary. The bloodstone ring had been her wedding gift to Mary. As Mary had been born in March, the gem was her birthstone. Clugg well understood the connection. Although the case had taken place before his time, it was so well publicised in the area it had become the subject of a popular ballad. Mary Gray had married a young man called Basil Osborne on her 18th birthday. She had written a letter to John Bodneys, who had been her sweetheart since childhood, asking him to forgive her. An hour before the couple was to embark upon their honeymoon, Mary told her sister she would like to spend some time alone in the upstairs bedroom they had shared. When Osborne arrived in the carriage to pick her up, she still had not come down. Feeling frightened, he and Ellen forced their way into the locked room, where there was no trace of the bride. A window opened out onto a balcony, where a flight of steps led down to an enclosed garden. But the garden was also empty. The now abandoned bridegroom passed away a month later, and the villagers blamed a broken heart. But now, 18 years on, the village had discovered what had become of Mary, as the skeleton had a broken neck. Ellen insisted on keeping her ill-fated sister's hand, which she said had been brought to her for a purpose which must be fulfilled. On her own demise, she left a bizarre provision in her will. Her housekeeper, Maggie Williams, would inherit her estate, but must display Mary's hand in some public place where it could some day confront the perpetrator. Maggie went on to open what became the finest pub in Willisham and enshrined the hand in a place of honour on one wall. Framed in a glass case and resting on a black velvet background, the bony fingers wearing the ring claimed the attention of every customer. After the initial shock of the exhibit had worn off, the tale of Mary's slaying was a frequent topic of conversation. One stormy night in March 1895, a stranger sat eavesdropping on chatting locals. The publican commented that it must have been such a night that the wind ripped out the old oak tree. The stranger, later described as a brooding man, looked up from his glass and asked, "What oak tree?" He was told to look at the case on the wall, and then he would hear the story. Moments later, the stranger began screaming and was sagging against the wall, with blood dripping from his hands. An older man sitting at the bar recognised him as Mary's long-absent former sweetheart, John Bodneys. When Constable Clugg attended the scene, the bleeding man immediately confessed to the slaying of Mary Gray. In a fit of jealousy, he had found the bride alone in her room and, muffling her cries, carried her from the house. Bodneys insisted that he had meant her no harm, but when they came to the large oak tree, she was struggling so hard he had used unintentional force. He left her lifeless form in a shallow grave below the oak and tried to distance himself from Willisham forever. But he had never had a moment's peace since the crime, and ultimately seemed drawn to return to the village. While in the local jail awaiting trial, he died of what was described as no known disease before his hearing could commence. The authorities dismissed the superstition that an evildoer's hands sometimes drip blood when they face the proof of their crime, but the folk in the village knew what they had witnessed. They buried Mary Gray's severed hand with the rest of her skeleton. Then they ceremoniously burned the shirt now smeared by John Bodney's bloody fingers the night he came face to face with his guilt. The fight with a ghost. Historian M.J. Wayland has uncovered this strange witness statement given by James Durham to the Reverend Harry Kendall, who was a congregational minister in the late 19th century. Durham, the writer of the statement, was a night watchman at the old Darlington and Stockton station in Darlington in December 1890. He would go on duty at about 8 p.m. and come off at 6 a.m. and had been there 2 or 3 years when this bizarre encounter occurred. On one shift, just after midnight, he was feeling cold and decided to go down some steps to the porter's room to get something to eat. In the room, which was connected to a coal house, a fire was always kept going. Durham descended the steps and took off his overcoat, then seated himself on the bench opposite the fire. He had just turned up the gas when an unknown man emerged out of the coal house, who was then followed by a black retriever dog. Durham recorded that as soon as the man entered, he kept his eye upon him, and the man also watched him back intently as he moved to stand in front of the fire. There he stood, staring at Durham, whereupon an unnerving smile came across his face. He wore an old-fashioned cut-away coat with gilt buttons and a stand-up collar, and a Scotch cap. Suddenly, quite unexpectedly, he struck out at Durham, who had the impression that he had hit him, upped his fist and struck back at him. But his fist seemed to sink through the man and smashed against the stone fireplace, knocking the skin off his knuckles. However, the man seemed to be struck back into the fire, and he let out an eerie, unearthly squeak. His dog immediately seized Durham by the calf of his leg and seemed to cause him pain. The man then recovered his stance, called off the dog with a kind of click of the tongue, and both retreated back into the coal house. Durham lit his lantern and peered into the coal house, but found neither dog nor man, and no exit for them except for the door by which they had entered. He was convinced that what he had seen was ghostly, and for several weeks thereafter his account caused quite a stir around the railway yard. He was variously asked if he had had a nightmare or been inebriated, replying to the latter question that he had been a teetotaler for 49 years. Increasing the general interest in the encounter was the fact that several years ago a man employed in the station office had taken his own life and was carried into that very cellar. Durham knew nothing of this event, but was told that his description corresponded exactly to the man's appearance and dress, and even that he owned a black retriever, just like the one that had bitten him. Incidentally, Durham noted that no mark or scar remained on the spot where the dog seemed to have seized him. Reverend Kendall gave a glowing reference confirming James Durham's truthfulness and reliability in reporting his encounter. He was strongly inclined to the opinion that Durham was fully awake and that his vision was genuinely apparitional. Kendall visited the station and confirmed all Durham's descriptions. His guide was an old railway official who remembered the clerk, a man named John Winter, who had taken his own life. He showed Kendall the spot where it had all taken place. Over a century later, in October 2000, Two amateur historians, named Olive Howe and Irene MacLeod, further confirmed the identity of the somewhat aggressive spectre that appeared to James Durham. During a search of Darlington's archives, they located the death certificate of a ticket clerk by the name of Thomas Munro Winter, who passed by his own hand in 1845, aged 29. In a statement to the Northern Echo, the two researchers reported that they were elated to have Durham's account confirmed, notwithstanding the tragic circumstances. His cause of death was acknowledged as self-inflicted. He was described as being in a state of unsound mind, and his occupation was ticket clerk. They had found the ghost, although the reason he attacked poor James Durham was still a mystery.